Hello, and welcome to today's event. My name is James Leffler. I am happy to welcome you to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. I am a friend of the university and the institute hosting us today. I teach at Johns Hopkins University. But we are here because of Professor Alon Confino, who is director of the Institute for Holocaust Memory and Genocide Studies at UMass, who has generously welcomed us into this space to talk about a book that is an extraordinary book that we're going to have the pleasure of discussing today. So I want to thank Professor Confino, and I also want to thank the IHMGS Administrative Coordinator, Eric Ross, for coordinating this and making this possible for us to join together today. I'm going to introduce the panelists in just a moment. But I'll just say this is a webinar format, and you can feel free to put questions in as we go. We will make an effort to turn to some of them as we get towards the second half of the hour or 75 minutes that we'll go for today. We are recording, just so you know, and we look forward to really a wonderful discussion. It's really a chance to talk about a book that I'm going to hold up because this is a book event and it's a great book. That is a first book by a veteran author and writer who many of us know through his contributions to literary and musical criticism and writing. This is, of course, Jeremy Eichler, who's with us today, a critic and historian who serves as the Boston Globe's classical music critic, has done so since 2006. You can find his writing there regularly as well as in other places such as the New York Times, New Yorker, and beyond. Jeremy has a PhD in history from Columbia, has been engaged with university-based academia also for some time and currently serves as humanist in residence at the Royal Conservatory of Music in Toronto. Maybe he'll tell us about that if we have time in the course of our conversation today. We're here, of course, though, because of the book Time's Echo, The Second World War, the Holocaust, and the Music of Remembrance. And I could really almost spend all of our time just reciting its accolades and prizes. It's worth mentioning a few because it tells us something about the importance of this book and the range of this book. Was, of course, named History Book of the Year by the Sunday Times, the Outstanding Music Book of this in several years by the Times Literary Supplement. And on this side of the pond, it was awarded an unprecedented 3 National Jewish Book Awards, including Book of the Year, which the jury described as, quote, a groundbreaking achievement in memorial history. I think that's a really powerful phrase that will probably help us to orient our conversation. There are many, many other accolades that attend this book, including being selected as a favorite book of 2023 by the New York Times, the New Yorker, National Public Radio, and so on and so forth. And it speaks to the rare kind of book that we all prize, which can expand our historical understanding and engage us as readers who have ears and hearts and minds that are not exhausted by the question of the past, but also how it lives inside our world today. So to capture that richness, I'm really delighted to be able to moderate a conversation with Jeremy and 2 other extraordinary interlocutors who are equally distinguished commentators and really excavators of memory in our day-to-day. Joining me is Ruth Franklin, a distinguished writer and critic whose work can also be found regularly in the pages of the New Yorker, the New Yorker Review Books, and elsewhere. She teaches at Columbia University, the 92nd Street Y, and other venues. And she's, of course, the author of 2 really important books, Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, and particularly relevant to our conversation today, A Thousand Darknesses, Lies and Truth in Holocaust Fiction, her acclaimed study of Holocaust writing. Our other member of the panel is Todd Pressner, who was chair of UCLA's Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies. Previously, he chaired UCLA's Digital Humanities program for a full decade. And before that, concurrent with part of that time, served as director of UCLA's Center for Jewish Studies. Todd's fields of research include German Jewish history, literature and culture, digital humanities, and Holocaust studies. And he's particularly poised to comment on this because he has a really important book of his own that is about to come out this fall from Princeton University Press called Ethics of the Algorithm, Digital Humanities and Holocaust Memory. So you can see we have a lot to talk about because we have a lot of points of entry into this conversation. And the best way we concluded to get us going was to hear from the author himself. So I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy and ask him to share some words with us. Then I'm going to turn back to Todd and Ruth and ask them to share some reflections on a question about what this book means for a lot of the concerns. You'll see in the chat a link with more information on the book if you haven't seen it yet or want to know more about it. And again, we invite you to share your questions with us. So Jeremy, please.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, James, for this beautiful, elegant, thoughtful introduction, very generous introduction to our conversation today. I couldn't be more excited to be here with the three of you. So first of all, my thanks to each of you as panelists, to James, Todd, and Ruth, and my thanks as well to Alon Confino for hosting us today, to the Institute, and to Alon's predecessor, the Institute's founding director, James Young, whose own work on memory has also been very inspiring for my own. I thought that before we dive into the discussion, aware that the book just came out a few months ago, I would just give the briefest of introductions to what this thing actually is, because it sort of straddles a bunch of different genres and blurs some distinctions we're used to, I think. And in a few words, there are many different kind of registers or layers, I would say, to Time's Echo. It is a book about musical memorials, sort of on the surface, and in general, it traces the war-haunted paths of four composers through the years of the Second World War and the Holocaust: Schoenberg, Strauss, Shostakovich, and Britten. It tells the story of the extraordinary musical memorials that they created, works such as A Survivor from Warsaw, which was one of the first major musical memorials to the Holocaust. That was by Schoenberg. Strauss's Metamorphosen, Britten's War Requiem, Shostakovich's Babi Yar Symphony. These are some of the kind of the touchstones. But before I realized in writing the book that before really getting our minds around these post-war requiems of really profound mourning, that we also perhaps needed to understand as readers, the important role of in the sort of aspect of music's history, its role in carrying forward not just these memory of these foundational 20th century traumas, but also its role in carrying forward these earlier utopian dreams of German culture. So the first two chapters of the book are about that dream. I discuss German Jewish history and identity, its evolution from sort of Moses Mendelssohn onward, the invention of the idea of German music and its kind of co-creation by both Germans and Jews, and the concept of Bildung, which we may circle back to in our panel today, I guess, depending on how the conversation evolves. But this untranslatable word that many of you may know is, speaks to this subject of the kind of the belief in the ennobling power of culture itself to renovate the self. And this is the kind of prehistory that the book also excavates, telling the stories of the premieres of these musical memorials. I realized also was a way of opening up what were for me these kinds of fascinating windows onto the social history of memory, the ways that the story of the war and the Holocaust were told differently in different countries, in different places. And oftentimes, I mean, there is a specialist literature about the history of post-war memory, but one is hard pressed to find many examples that deal with music's place in that history. And it was an important place. It is an important place. And so that's also something Time's Echo tries to do. But I come to all of this as both a historian and as a critic, which is to say someone who has spent the last 25 years thinking not only about this art form's history, but also how it's experienced in the here and now. And I wanted to figure out a way of thinking and writing about musical memorials that did justice to their unique, and I argue in some ways uniquely effective ways of reaching us as these memorials in sound. How might memorials in sound do their work, so to speak, differently than memorials in stone. That's one, or memorials in words alone, or in film, other art forms. What is music's own unique, special, uh, and in some ways particularly powerful way of burning through what the survivor Jean Amery called the cold storage of memory. Excuse me, the cold storage of history. Uh, Maybe in a distinction we could come back to. Um, one the last thing I'll say probably, and then really turn it over, but by way of summary, is just that I came to Times Echo also aware of approaching all of these questions at a particular in a particular historical moment, in a particular kind of time horizon, a distance from the event itself, which is to say that this is a book that's very much written and positions its examination as taking place in the twilight of living memory. We are right now, living through a period where the generation that experienced this era directly and is capable of telling its own stories is receding. And so, what are the ways in which art in general and music in particular might make its own kind of intervention? What can we say on behalf of such an intervention at this point in the twilight of living memory? And what might be inviting readers really to think about this distinction between information about the past, which we have in abundance through Wikipedia, through archives, through a million other points of entry, and knowledge about the past, which perhaps art gives us in a different kind of way, allowing for a different sort of felt contact, a texture, perhaps even an empathy for these earlier lives and earlier times, and a deeper sense of connectedness. So I'll pause there, and I know that James has a framing question or two for all of us to consider as we kind of open it up into a four-way conversation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, so I mean, you've already teed it up for us, which is a question: what is this? What is this moment, right? And what does the study of memory mean in this moment? So I'd love to begin by asking first Ruth and then Todd to talk a little bit about the well, to borrow a phrase from the name you mentioned, the texture of memory, right? If this is a moment of change for living memory of the Holocaust, it's also a moment where a lot in the way we understand, interpret, and frame memory itself is changing because of technology, because of questions about the structure of society, the humanities, and so on and so forth. So my question actually is really just I'd love to ask Ruth and then Todd to reflect on that and to think in particular about this bold claim you're making that sound is a special pathway through this. And how did that strike each of you, coming as you do from the fields of memory studies and thinking specifically about media and different forms of it? What do you make of this moment and the book's entrance into this moment in light of that? Ruth, why don't you start us off?
Sure. Excuse me. Sure. Well, thank you, James, for opening this up. To all of you for inviting me here. Um, Jeremy gave a beautifully articulate and comprehensive description of the contents of the book. But I want to emphasize just how beautifully composed and how kind of mesmerizing its effect is. And that's what I'm going to try to demonstrate in my remarks here. Just picking up from this point about how we're in this kind of twilight moment, this threshold between the living memory of the Holocaust and all of those of us who came later. There's a wonderful line in the book from Ilya Ehrenberg, the Soviet chronicler of the Holocaust, who says even very, immediately, even, writing even as the Holocaust is taking place about the early reports from Majdanek, he writes, "I cannot describe this terrible picture. For centuries, people will come back to this, trying to comprehend the full magnitude of the suffering." And I found that such a profound quote because, here we are, it's not yet a century later, but, here we are still kind of ceaselessly returning to this site of suffering, I think in part driven by the compulsion, this belief that nobody has fully comprehended it, has fully described it, because it exists in this space beyond our imagination. And what I think is so beautiful and generous and humanistic about Jeremy's book is the way that it opens up music as a potential space that can kind of reach beyond the human imagination and exist literally on another plane. Because, we are all belated here, and we talk about, remembering the Holocaust, and we analyze different ways in which it's possible for literature and history to allow us to have this kind of vicarious memory of these events while acknowledging the essential paradox that we can't remember what we weren't present for. And the larger question is, how do we build our connection to this past in a way that will help us understand it, help us honor those who experienced it, and, obviously, hopefully help us not repeat it. And so I think Time's Echo just beautifully enacts its central idea that music can serve, as Jeremy writes, as an unconscious chronicle of its times. And I'm still quoting here, a witness to history and a carrier of memory. And the book does that by demonstrating how that actually works in the hands, or we could say the ears, of the author himself, who serves throughout as a kind of model for how the reader might approach these musical compositions, but also kind of the larger historical episode. The works themselves, as he explains, become these kinds of spaces of encounter that includes both their prehistories and the stories of their reception, which I think the narrative, just the historical narrative here of what happened, the circumstances leading up to these works' composition, the circumstances around their premieres, I found just really fascinating as a moment in history that I didn't know anything about. And so telling in terms of how the works were received and the kinds of national narratives that they either became a part of or didn't become a part of. It's one of the book's most beautiful ideas, is that it's not only we who remember music, but also music that remembers us, by accumulating layers of meaning over time and generating meaning out precisely from that relationship between the music and its listeners. And I'll just quote one more of Jeremy's beautiful lines, which is, every historical work of music is a kind of mobile emanation, a message from the past that is constantly in flux, its precise coordinates, with help from the composer, the performer, and the listener, translated anew in each hearing. And so Jeremy discusses in this book the idea of deep listening. Listening, as he says, with an understanding of music as time's echo. And this listening itself becomes a kind of musical interpretation, a kind of performance of memory or an activity within this memory space, an interpretation of the musical composition across time and space. And this is something that he practices in the book and also models for the listener. And he does so through his own presence in the text, where part of, I think, one of the loveliest elements of this book is that it exists in so many different genres, and one of them is, what we might call travel writing, in which he actually visits many of the sites of the premieres, or sites that were important to the composers, to the composition of the work, and discusses his experience there. And to be frank, it's an approach that I've often felt personally skeptical about, partially because, as Claude Lanzmann shows us so definitively in Shoah, in so many of these spaces, nothing is left of what we are trying to bear witness to there. And so you could ask, what's the point of visiting a site of emptiness? And Jeremy demonstrates in a couple of these places precisely what the point is, how it's possible to receive these emanations over time, even if the thing we're looking at is no longer there. And I'll give just two especially resonant examples of the way this takes place in the book. So there's an extended chapter narrating the composition of Britten's War Requiem. in which Jeremy delves very deeply into the English national narrative around World War I, as well as World War II, to explain, among other things, the incorporation of Wilfred Owen's poetry into this requiem. And he reads the fractured structure of the requiem as a kind of fragmentation of religious belief itself. The idea that the history of the 20th century has even made a ruin of the Christian religion. And then he recounts the deeply emotional premiere of the piece at the bombed out and then partially resurrected Coventry Cathedral, which of course was bombed during World War II and then rebuilt partially in a modernist, very kind of radical modernist interpretation that incorporates the ruins of the old cathedral as part of the new structure. And so when Jeremy finally visits the Cathedral of Coventry, he has this moment in the text where he actually hears the cathedral bells, which remain in the medieval tower. Even though so much of the church has been destroyed, these bells are still there and still ringing. And he writes that the sound of the bells seemed to carry within itself the resonance of all of the times they had rung before. And he imagines them, they remind him not only of the bells that ring during Britain's war requiem as part of the music, but also as the way that they must have rung on the night of the bombing itself. He writes, for a few fleeting moments, the sound was everywhere. The years melted away and the past drifted free from the sovereignty of time. So it's through the hearing of the sound itself, being present on the site to experience that, but also through this act of radical historical imagination, radical empathy, drawing a bridge between the present and the past, that this enduring sound allows for the creation of. And I'll give just one more example before handing things over to Todd, which is that just another really deeply powerful chapter for me in this book was the one about Babi Yar, the site in Kiev where the Nazis executed around 30,000 Ukrainian Jews atop a ravine that their bodies then fell into, and which became a huge grave. And as Jeremy describes in great detail, the memory of this incident has been deeply contested and problematic in that the Soviets didn't acknowledge the Jewish identity of the victims, and it tried to destroy the site itself by creating a dam that would flood it with mud. And then in what Jeremy calls this kind of tragically literal version of the return of the repressed, the dam actually breaks and there's a horrible mudslide that kills even more people. It's just a site really of unspeakable tragedy. But when Jeremy visits it in the presence, he finds people sunbathing by the tombstones. It's a park, it's all paved over. Everything is gone, apparently. And the filling in of the site becomes an embodiment of the way that, the Soviets repressed the memory of what took place there. But then there's this other beautiful moment where Jeremy's visiting with a guide who shows him what might be an access to the ravine, the former site of the tragedy, and says this is the place where you can see it. And then he returns to it later on his own and is unable to find it. And I think that inability itself really encapsulates the position that we all find ourselves in at this historical moment. Jeremy writes in the book about what's called missing grave syndrome, how hard it is to find closure when there are no graves to be found, and posits that it's through music that we can find that closure, that music can itself constitute a memorial that holds the memory of the placeless dead, arguing that that's what Shostakovich's 13th Symphony, which includes a setting of the poem Babi Yar by the Soviet poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko, that it stands in for the memorial that's missing in real life. And it reminded me also of Paul Celan's famous poem Todesfuge, where a description of, again, a musical motif in poetry that describes the activities of inmates in a concentration camp as digging a grave in the air. And I wondered if in some, sort of way beyond understanding, that could almost be what Paul Celan was imagining, that the music can itself be a kind of grave in the air, a memorial for that which we can no longer see and commemorate in other ways. Okay, and with that, I'll turn it over to Todd.
Great. Thank you so much, Ruth. This was so deeply insightful, and I think that your remarks, I hope, will complement mine in various ways. And also want to thank James and also, of course, Jeremy for inviting me to engage with this work. And I really had the opportunity to meet Jeremy in person in Los Angeles back in the fall, and immediately was so driven to delve into this work. And so I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to focus a little bit more on questions of method. And it's a bit of reading in the margins in some ways of this book. And it really is to ask the question of how to compose a memorial history. So how does one put this together? And we've already sort of touched upon some of the uniqueness of this work. It's been called, genre blurring. It's brought together so many aspects of memory studies. It brings together art and music and sound studies. It brings, of course, together intellectual and cultural history. And it also changes, I'd say, register at various points. It moves from I guess third person to first person narration. There's an experiential dimension to it, and I wanted to think a little bit about three figures that come into play along with the four composers. So the four composers, of course, being Schoenberg, Strauss, Britten, and Shostakovich. But there's at least three other methodological figures that I think are really critical for understanding the composition of this memorial history. And those are Benjamin, Sebald, and Celan. And I want to talk a little bit about all three because they figure in at different ways. Celan comes only in the coda of the book, but Benjamin kind of figures in throughout, and Sebald as well. And it's particularly Austerlitz. And it's interesting to me because none of these figures were directly involved with sound, but they were very much involved with language. And of course, language is not only written, it's also spoken, right? And it's sung, and there's questions around voice. And so as we think about this question of how does one move away from composing history as cold storage or from cold storage, and in terms of making those layers of meaning not only visible, but also audible, right? How can we hear history? We might ask a question of what kind of method one might employ as a historian to do this. And so, as Jeremy's major argument is that music functions in some ways as culture's memory. And that means it's very much not frozen. It's not information that's simply transmitted. It's not a body of facts, but it has something that speaks to a present, right? That interpersonal, that ethical dimension, in fact, is, I think, a really critical part of the creation of knowledge. So let me start with Benjamin briefly and just kind of give you a sense about sort of these moments that I think really figure into the compositional strategies of this work. Of course, Benjamin's kind of biggest reflection on methodology was in the Arcades project, which is a project about architecture in some ways, but it was about time as well. And so, how does one compose? And at one point, he says, to discover in the analysis of the small individual moment the crystal of the entire event. And I love this phrase, the small individual moment. What is that? It's the tree that only exists as a stump. It's the sounds of the bells, right? This individual moment. It's that moment on November 4th, 1948, in the Carlisle Gymnasium of New Mexico, where Schoenberg's Survivor from Warsaw was first performed. It's to discover in that small moment, right? That micro moment of time, the entire event. What's the entire event? The entire event is European humanism and its catastrophes. right? It's 300 years of history from the Enlightenment ideas of liberation and tolerance and equity, and it's the concentration camps, right? That's the total event that Germany's confronting in these tiny individual moments. And this is a kind of a Benjaminian, I mean, it's an idea that I think Jeremy takes and kind of remixes and reworks and deepens. It's not just an application of Benjamin here, it's a reconfiguration, right? It's a reconfiguration because these moments, Benjamin calls them this focus on the Abfall der Geschichte, the trash of history, but it's really the refuse, the remains, the detritus, the things that we can still be attuned to. And then it becomes a question of how do we do that? Well, they have to be recognized and they have to be readable. Benjamin uses the term Erkennbarkeit to talk about that which is that the possibility that something can be recognized as a concern of the present. In fact, it's there in the theses on the philosophy of history that Jeremy will often cite, not only the very famous angel of history, but also the idea that the image, and we might say the sounds, because Benjamin always talks about images. He's very ocular centric in some ways, but the sounds of the past, and I'm just reworking Benjamin here, for every sound of the past that is not recognized by the present as one of its own concerns, threatens to disappear irretrievably. Right? This is also where we are, this twilight memory moment, right? If we don't recognize, if we're not open to these sounds, these images, these moments of the past, so there's a threat that they could be gone. And so in many ways, it's to create these moments, these kind of dialectical images, these constellations. And I'd say this is a work in some ways of constellation thinking, where again, we're recognizing that fragility. But it's not to carry these objects, in a sort of timeless way, throughout the past, right? It's not that they're timeless. They're in time, and they embody time. They're marked by time. They're scarred by time, right? And then they come to us, but we have to be open to them. And in many ways, I think Jeremy is a guide that's helping us to be open to these scarred objects, right? These scarred sounds, and the ways in which they could be passed on to us. So that's Benjamin as one methodological, I think, part. I don't have time to talk a lot about Sebald, but it's really interesting to me that there's moments in Time's Echo where you quote Austerlitz, you quote, of course, Sebald, imagining not only Austerlitz talking, but of course the German narrator who's listening. So Austerlitz is really a stage of is a book about dialogue. I mean, it's essentially the entire thing is ostensibly based on a German narrator who's encountering a Jewish man who is searching for, in some ways, the remains of his own history that he doesn't, his own memories for that matter, that he doesn't know. And the German narrator composes them. He listens. He writes the story. Everything about Austerlitz is, Austerlitz said, or Austerlitz said to so-and-so, who said to so-and-so, who then told me. The narrator is also composing photographs. And of course, Jeremy's book is full of photographs, uncaptioned photographs, in very much a kind of Sebaldian way. And those photographs, they don't just gloss the text, they don't explain it, but they are in tension, in a kind of very productive, generative tension with what we're reading. So we're reading, we're looking, but we're also, of course, listening, right? And that's the idea that we're listening to these echoes, these sounds that may still encounter us. There's a beautiful point at the beginning of the book where I think, Jeremy, you I think reference Sebald. You say that music also remembers us. It comes on page 8, very early on. Music also remembers us. So it's that it made something about the humankind, about what we did, what our species, our pasts, and it somehow embodies something. And there's this idea of transmission and encounter that comes. And I'm going to read a small, just in the interest of time, I'll just have a small little piece by Austerlitz I want to read. This is very small. And this is Austerlitz is in a train station, and he encounters a cast iron column, and the column is cast in iron. It holds up this great train station. He says, "All I remember of Pilsen, where we stopped for some time," said Austerlitz, is that I went out on the platform to photograph the capital of a cast iron column. Jeremy's also photographing things. He's out there, he's taking pictures. Cast iron column, which had touched some chord of recognition in me. What made me uneasy at the sight of it, however, was not the question whether the complex form of the capital, now covered with a puce-tinged incrustation, had really impressed itself on my mind, with the children's transport the summer of 1939. So Auschwitz finds out that he was sent on a child's transport. But the idea, ridiculous in itself, that this cast iron column with its scaly surface might remember me and may, if I may put it that way, said Austerlitz, a witness to what I could no longer recollect myself. So the column might remember Austerlitz, right? The music might remember us. And that second part, I think, is so critical here, is when the music or the column becomes a witness to what I could no longer recollect myself, to what I can no longer remember. Perhaps because it's become lost, perhaps because the experiential memory is no longer with us, perhaps because we're in that twilight moment where the eyewitnesses who were there are no longer with us. And that then means the responsibility is on those of us born after. It's on different people. And so let me end by just saying just a very quick word about Ceylon, and it's the moment of the very coda of your book, Jeremy, where you engage with Ceylon and you quote the Bremen speech, the idea that music has to pass through things in a very similar way that poetry passes through. The thousand darknesses of death-bringing speech is what you rework at the end. That music passed through and it moves through time. And it's an extraordinary image. And when Ceylon talks about this, he's talking, of course, about a poem. You're talking about a work of music. But what it really means is it's that ethical dimension of reception. That is, say, a poem is essentially dialogical. It reaches out to something. It reaches out to someone. And Ceylon says, etwas Offenstehendes, Besetzbares, auf ein ansprechbares Du vielleicht, to something standing open, occupiable, to a addressable you. And I think that's the idea that you're trying to instantiate in this book, that it takes us in this moment of ethics, right? For us to listen, to us to be in dialogue with a you, whether it's a you as that moment of composition, but it's also that you that performs the music, this idea of living with ghosts, of hearing history, of attunement to deep history, and how one in method, right, in composition and writing, how that becomes instantiated as a practice. And I think that's really, to me, what I take out of this book is really that ethical dimension of what it means to be open to these sounds, foreign or as distant as they may be, in the present. So thank you.
Thank you both. Let me note, it's interesting. You both are talking about humanism and how much that depends on the human, right? And you're both sharing with us your the ways in which the book passes through you, right? And through your own reading and through your own imaginations and through your own associations. So it's a very powerful kind of reflection of what Jeremy is giving us with asking us to experience along with him and let the music pass through us. On that note, a technical thing, let me just invite people who are with us to follow the lead that has begun in the Q&A and put in a question if you have one that we can thread into our conversation if possible. But now let me happily turn back to Jeremy and let him share some responses and reactions.
Yes, well, thank you so much both to Ruth and to Todd. It's a wonderful and slightly out of body experience to be in this conversation and hearing, as James just described, just the ideas and animating impulses of the book, hearing which parts connected with each of you and sparked the thoughts that you shared. I couldn't be more grateful for your observations and their generosity of spirit. And I think that this question, slipping back to my notes here, I think that this what you touched on, Ruth, was absolutely at the heart one of the intentions I had as a writer, what you mentioned as sort of travel writing, bringing the readers with me to these places. I thought I in a way that impulse, I think, grew out of my years of working as a critic, where one is attending, where one is there's the experience of working as a music critic over the years has attuned me just in some degree to thinking about these questions of surrogacy. Because when one is there as a critic at an event, you're trying to capture it in words, for people who often aren't there. And so this idea of how one writes with a sense of surrogacy for a reader, and it's a really delicate dance, because I wanted very much to have those passages be one that don't so much cancel out the possibility of a reader's own subjective experience in joining me. Oh, well, that's how he experienced it, but rather opened it up, and it kind of invited a reader in, invited a reader to sort of um, try on for size some of the ideas, to try on really a sensibility about thinking about art and culture and history and memory that the book very much tries to enact. And so the travel writing portions became an opportunity to try to really do that enactment, and see if they might, if they might resonate. The I really appreciated also Todd's comments on Benjamin Celan and Sebald. I guess we could also include, on the methodology side, certainly another figure a little bit in that ilk who appears and reappears in the book is Adorno. And 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 I I do think that these figures I were very much, the example of their own work. I tried to sort of take inspiration from. Of course, to some extent, I write them in as at some points they kind of leave the idea bench and become actual actors in the story. As when the book tells about about Adorno and Thomas Mann and Schoenberg all in exile in Los Angeles, in the 30s and 40s, and in this kind of bizarre quirk that's, on one hand, astonishing and somehow also at the same time preordained by the currents of German history, exactly as Schoenberg is writing A Survivor from Warsaw, his grand musical memorial to the Holocaust. That's is when Thomas Mann is writing his own Dr. Faustus, his great post-war novel, with Adorno as an advisor. So Adorno at that point becomes not just kind of a contributor to the work's sort of idea space, but also one of its characters. I did think a lot about this question. And the last thing I'll say about method before turning it back over to our moderator, I did there, the sort of doyen of memory studies, I think it might be fair to say, Alida Osman writes about really thoughtfully about the nature of cultural memory, and she divides up cultural memory into what she calls storage memory and functional memory. Storage memory being the kinds of memory that exists in archives. It's sort of the raw information. Maybe it exists maybe monographs could also be sort of containers of storage memory, deep, rigorous thinking, but that's somehow all too frequently, alas, sort of living on a library shelf, perhaps somewhere, and then contrast that with functional memory, which is memory about the past, that is this, if you will, the storied past, past that the stories we tell about the past and the aspects of the past that are sort of known to a society and available on an individual level as we each try to construct narrations about our own identities. And so the book, in if I the book, if I could say, tries in some sense both contribute some original archival research to the storage depots of memory, so to speak, but also relies on the work of generations of scholars who have already filled that storage depot so generously. We're kind of drowning, if you will, in information about this past. But some of it, I felt needed to be brought into this other functional domain, into the story domain. And so really this question of storytelling becomes central to the book itself, and also becomes the vehicle through which I hoped that some of these larger questions um, through which I attempted to engage with disciplinary scholars, scholars of history, scholars of music, scholars of memory. But the stories are also how these same questions I hoped might reach a broader reading public, who might be less interested in the methodological questions, but perhaps could come with me and come with the book through this kind of journey if it were, so to speak, on the wings of these different stories. So that's one other comment in terms of the method behind it all. Maybe I'll pause there and turn us back to you, James, and thank you both again to Ruth and to Todd for those comments.
Absolutely. I mean, I just want to hear more of all of you. So, but let me maybe extend this a little bit and ask about the sound and the sound part of it. One of the remarkable things about the book is just that we spent a long time here talking about the imagination and the reader, you just said too, but but Ruth mentioned at the beginning, it's also for the listener. And I'd love to hear maybe all three of you just reflect a little bit about does sound, particularly the sound of art music, right? Which is, it's different than the sound of the Yiddish folk song, recovered from the ghetto, or it's different than the cantorial chant that we associate, as somehow radiating outwards from the past. And Jeremy, you do such an amazing job of making us feel like we're hearing the music, even though we're only reading about the music. So I'd love to hear maybe Ruth and Todd and you talk about that because it's a very interesting way in which it's an evocation through one medium of another medium, and it opens up a possibility. I feel like you're suggesting to us, no, don't look to me as your surrogate just to make you know what you should be listening for, but look to me as someone who can model for you what you can be listening for yourself when you get to this. So, Ruth, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the book, definitely generated in me the desire to revisit all of these pieces of music, or, to hear for the first time those I hadn't heard before. And, in a way that I feel like goes beyond what we might usually think of as musical appreciation. I was trained as a classical pianist and had many, many years of both music theory and music history, music composition, the whole thing, which is I was first introduced to Schoenberg in that context with, the idea of the 12-tone scale and all that. But, I think that it's very different to listen to his music with that kind of academic, or you could say mechanical understanding of how the music is put together. And at least for me in my education, the cultural and historical piece of it really was missing. I think, it's just fascinating to know that Schoenberg was writing these pieces in LA at the same time as Mann and this whole other group of exiles, which, is not something I was taught in music history class. The musical context, but also the cultural historical context and the way that current events, the events of the world brought them all to that place at that time, and to have such different reactions to it that played out in their music and their novels. As a critic, I'm always, I think, most interested in kind of the idea of how this person came to conceive this work of art at this particular moment in history. And I think your book does a great job of, of exploring that and of modeling this methodology that the reader might also bring to other works to experience them in that way.
Yeah, Todd.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I certainly agree with everything that's been said. I wanted to think a little bit more maybe with Jeremy and Ruth and you, James, about this question around this uh, move, I guess I would say that's central, I think, to what you're trying to do in the book, Jeremy, from information to knowledge, right? I think information, it kind of goes back to this idea, that distinction again of the storage, right? The recording perhaps put in an archive, or the score, right? That's then deposited into a folder, and it's labeled, and one could ask the archivist to get it out, and there it is, and it has some metadata associated with it, and there's data. This is information, right? These are facts, these are numbers, these are enumerations, these are catalogs. These are all the things that maybe are the conditions of possibility for us to have knowledge of the past, but they're not knowledge of the past. And that's a distinction, Jeremy, I think that you make very early on, and I think that motivates in some ways the way in which sound and hearing then operate as a way of composing composing this kind of memorial history, right? So the cold storage, the archive, the containers, the information, the enumerations, the objects. Yes, we want to have those. We need those. We need those libraries. And I think you might say there's a proliferation of these things, so much so that we're at a scale that maybe we can't possibly even, maybe we need other tools, to use. I mean, in some ways, this kind of goes to some of my more recent work, which is like, how do we, confront these huge archives, of thousands, millions of objects, right? You probably need some kind of computational tools, but don't those necessarily reduce it back to data and information, right? So can there be like an ethics, you might say, that allows us to still have knowledge, to listen, to hear, to be affected by using these tools, and perhaps even the fact that most of the stuff is coming to us in different modalities than the ones that it was created, right? As things become, our cultural history becomes digitized and turns into digital archives, right? This is primarily the way that we're going to interrelate, or relate to the past, perhaps even the voices of the dead. They're going to come to us via a computer interface or a search algorithm or whatever else. This is by definition kind of an estrangement and also a transformation of those objects. But I think the question that you're after, Jeremy, is really, how do we get to functional memory, right? How do we get to the storied past? How do we get to storytelling? But also, I'd say listening, right? It's not only hearing, it's listening. And listening is something more transformative. And I think listening goes also to ethics. It goes to that practicality, right? We're transformed by it. It affects us. It affects who we are, how we act, what we do, what choices, what values we have. And I think it's that critical kind of nexus between moving from information to knowledge, to moving from data to listening, that I think is so critical for your work. And it's really, again, because it's about sound. Listening is by definition at the fore always.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, thank you for both of those observations, Ruth and Todd. I think that listening, it's interesting. I mean, I think that just to respond to what you were just saying, Todd, listening, absolutely, in some sense of, that's how the medium of sound is received. This kind of the auditory processing channels, but listening also, the book really wanted to invite readers to think more deeply about listening as its own kind of exercise in meaning creation, and also even more deeply in knowledge creation. I was really struck by the writing of the survivor psychoanalyst Dory Laub writes about how in the case of trauma testimony, that the trauma victim, even if there are all of these kind of, again, historical data-driven documents that testify to the traumatic event as having really happened, that the trauma victim doesn't really know about that, doesn't really even believe it, or the knowledge doesn't exist for him or her internally until their story has been listened to, has been witnessed, has been heard on this deeper level. And Laub has this line that stuck with me, that the listener becomes party to the creation of knowledge de novo. And so this idea we may not have soon, we may not have many listeners, excuse me, many survivors to whom we can listen to directly in the same room, because of course this twilight of living memory theme. But this idea that perhaps there is a kind of that art in its own, in a sense, if we are going to have as a society and as individuals knowledge of these events as separate from information about them, that art and in my case music may well be a crucial ally, a vehicle for attaining that knowledge. And that all of this is also by way of saying that these musical memorials give us a kind of challenge. We're not there to be entertained. We are actually there to be witnesses in the way that Laub was requesting that trauma victims need witnesses. We are there to witness when we go to hear one of these pieces. We are there to witness an act of witness, and that this kind of knowledge, for it to even be said to in some basic way exist in these subsequent generations, that this knowledge has to be witnessed, has to be received, has to be listened to, or to return to the first word at the key point in Survivor from Warsaw. Schoenberg sets the Shema Yisrael with the 12-tone setting. The testimony has to be heard. So I think that's all that's all partly in response to the sound question and some of the information versus knowledge distinction. Yeah.
I could just really briefly interject there, just building on that. I also found it a fascinating point that you made in the book, that the meaning of the music changes over time, and that a work's first listeners may not be able to hear all of its dimensions in the way that we can from our historical distance. For instance, you make that point about Britain's War Requiem, that its initial listeners couldn't hear how subversive it was in the context of English nationalism and war, and the narratives around the war, in a way that a contemporary listener can.
I actually want to pick up on that because it dovetails with a question from Peter Gurevich about he asked a couple really interesting, insightful questions, but one is just what happens when a work affects us differently through time, or that's another version perhaps of Ruth's point, that what happens when the work's meaning just isn't stable, and yet it's supposed to be a carrier of something, and it's supposed to connect us to something. And really what I'm interested in hearing from Jeremy and from each of you is how that relates to this issue of really what Todd keeps calling ethics, right? If the sound and the art opens up a possibility, and Jeremy, you're telling us it's an invitation to have knowledge, to engage, to find a subject position of holding and touching the past, right? And then letting it flow through you. How do we understand that, in which it also means that you sort of have all the power and get to choose? Does the past still make a claim to you? And I'm asking a lot of things rolled into one, but I'm really asking sort of about if we're empowered, and this book really is an act of, I think, empowerment, like to the person who's not appreciative of this musical tradition, but curious about it, right? And to the person who is, but reduces it to kind of history of, oh, this is Shoah memory, and I need to reverentially kind of hear one thing in it. And you're saying, no, there's worlds and layers of meaning in this, and there's a tradition of humanism behind it. But what do we do with that power that we have to get to choose how to engage, versus the claim that you're saying this is to speak of Bildung is to make a really powerful ethical claim that this is not just something that we like or that builds our character, but this is a claim of the possibility of ethics. So I don't know, maybe each of you or one of you is primed to react and reflect a little bit on that.
Well, go ahead, Ruth, please.
I just was going to give sort of a quick reaction in the sense of building on ethics, is that I think another important dimension of Jeremy's book is to highlight the inseparability of the Jewish contribution to the German, what we might even call the German Jewish musical tradition. Making it clear the extent to which, far from being interlopers in Germany or in German culture, Jews are essential to the canon of German music, to not only in creating that canon of music as composers, but also in creating that canon as critics and appreciators, and just making it clear the extent to which what we might think of German musical culture is in fact German Jewish musical culture. And that strikes me as an important ethical stance, to restore the reality of history in a way that when that narrative has been obscured for political or for nationalistic, for ideological reasons.
Definitely.
That's such an important point, Ruth, and I'm so glad that you've put really kind of pointed us to that. There's a moment in your book where you talk about the German Jewish kind of dialectic, and you mentioned the hyphen or the slash or the kind of relationship between German and Jewish, and in fact they're deeply entangled, right? And that's the beauty of this book, is to show that these histories are so deeply entangled. They're and to separate them as if one existed without the other, or that they were in opposition or somehow in different spheres is not what you're about. It's actually to show how these moments show that deep kind of imbrication of these hopes and catastrophes, these ideas, these ideals, these kind of ways of composition and meaning making, right? And so I love the idea of really thinking about how to construct German Jewish history through this attention to entanglement. And I think that also raises the question then of a kind of ethics, the kind of ethics that I'm kind of was alluding to, certainly with Ceylon, as a kind of relational ethics. And I think that's the idea of a listener. It's similar to what Dory Laub says, like the necessity of the listener who is there, who's going to take in the story, who's open to the story. That's the same thing when Ceylon talks about being addressable, an addressable open you. He's clearly talking about Buber, here again, relational ethics. But what does that mean when the sound comes to us, right? Or the sound comes to us through time. You say it doesn't go beyond time or around it. It goes through, and it's transformed in that process, right? So it's like the sound doesn't arrive to us. I think you say the music doesn't arrive unscathed. It's affected by time. It's not the same. It doesn't just move through like as an object through time. It's the same thing. The Ninth Symphony is different before and after the war. It's different in different contexts, and so that means that how we're then attuned, right? What kind of attention we have, how we listen, our practices, those two affect what it is that we're hearing. So I love the idea that music travels through time. I think that is a space that opens up, this ethical claim, and it's in the relationality that happens.
Yeah. I would say also in the context of Ceylon and that idea of searching for the expressible you. And of course, so much of Ceylon's tragedy is that his listeners died out. The people who he's writing his poetry in German, testimony to the Holocaust, his listeners don't exist anymore by the time that he's writing that poetry. And by transgressing those linguistic lines, music offers access to a different kind of a listener who's not limited by linguistic boundaries the way Ceylon's listener might be.
That's very interesting.
And not just in some senses sort of transgressing linguistic lines, but also in a way, part of I think the extraordinary part of the sort of the set of elective affinities between music and memory as such has to do with music as a time-based art. And this idea that when a composer sets down notes on a page in, let's say, 1824, and then it's sort of in so doing distilling a subjective world, but also perhaps something about the world in which he or she is writing, the society at that time. And then we hear those notes pulled off a page 200 years later, where in a performance where there's a kind of there's a sort of Benjaminian way in which the sense of the now has expanded, and we're hearing the past literally speaking in the present. So music in this sense, or the tradition of music, of notated music we're talking about, also has this way of bringing sort of confounding the one-way linearity of time, challenging the objective distance of history, and bringing closer these events in the past, which far from the past, into the present in this viscerally powerful way. And in a very basic sense, it shares all of those qualities with memory itself. Memory also sort of flouting the one-way linearity of time and bringing that which is distant much closer to us, something that from many years ago could haunt our minds, and it oftentimes does haunt our minds with a power much more palpable and strong than something that maybe just happened yesterday. So that was sort of another way of getting at some of these questions, the intersections between memory and music and time and sound.
Mm, mm. Yeah, we're coming close to an end of our incredibly rich conversation here. And I want to give Jeremy the last word in a second, but maybe we have time for just a quick micro round. And there's a question here from Michael Zev Gordon, and I think it's an interesting question to get quick reactions to, which is just music with and without words. That's been, threaded through this conversation as we've sort of moved back and forth with that. And I don't know, there's probably not a quick answer to that. But maybe Jeremy, before you wrap up for us, did that weigh into your consideration when you thought about which to choose? You had to choose, these four. You had to choose these composers, and how they do and don't use words. And was that a factor for you, or was it more that it grew out of the clear position of these, artists in moments of remembrance?
Yeah, I think it was the latter mostly that drove the consideration, but it did in the end have a set of works, some of which had texts to work with, and some of which didn't. Strauss's Metamorphosen is the instrumental work,
Yeah.
but so it did give me a chance to invite the reader to join me in thinking about the difference between these two and the kind of this again is also something that music can do quite in some ways uniquely, is sort of express itself powerfully. We feel the meaning, but we can't always, it exists sometimes prior to language or sort of separate from language. Rilke calls it music, the language where languages end. I also often come back, for me, ironically, the ultimate comment describing Strauss's Metamorphosen might have come from Schoenberg, who was not speaking about that piece, but did have an observation about this kind of this semantic aspect of music's meaning generation. That Schoenberg once said that only in music can one confess one's heart while keeping one's secrets. And I think that's a line that speaks powerfully to what happens for Strauss in Metamorphosen. Yeah.
Yeah. Except for that inscription. Well, I guess
Except for the one inscription, two words in memoriam. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, listen, we are reaching our time here. I want to invite Jeremy in a second to share a closing thought with us, but first I want to thank Ruth and Todd for as promised, incredibly rich observations and commentaries and reactions to this, which the virtue of a book like this is that we get to kind of experience it, re-experience it, with other really informed and passionate readers. And I invite people to look at the website to not only see the book, but there is a Times Echo Live dimension of this, right? There are some live events, which opens it up in a whole other fascinating direction. We could spend another hour discussing your experience with that, Jeremy, and what it's like to have the book come alive in a different way. But let me first also thank Professor Alon Confino for hosting us here at this institute, which, after all, is committed to probing these questions about Holocaust, genocide, and memory in really powerful ways and asking ethical questions. So there is more to be seen there if folks are interested about the programming that happens at this institute. But now, Jeremy, take us out, if you will, with your coda, as it were.
Right. Quickly echoing Jim. Am I on mute? No, I'm not.
No, we hear you.
Okay. Quickly echoing Jim's comments of thanks to Alon, and to Ruth and to Todd and to James himself as our fearless moderator. This has been really an inspiring conversation for me, and really one of the singular pleasures of this whole sharing the book after this long solitary journey of writing it has been having it be sort of open to the play of other people's thoughts and imaginations. And so I really appreciated all of the thoughts expressed in today's panel. Where to end us? I struggled with this as writing the book is sort of what I did not want to leave readers in sort of a pool of depression or there's so much difficult history that's recounted in this book, but there is also this kind of memory of humanism in these earlier traditions, and a plea in the final pages to also think of art and music as a kind of holding open a space for the possible. This is kind of one of Adorno's ideas, as well as kind of and Ernst Bloch writes about a state of not yet being, the noch nicht sein, music maybe carrying forward a sense of these hopes and dreams of earlier eras that have not yet come to be. And the last sort of thinker that I come to in the coda is maybe where we could end is with Freud's really beautiful essay from 1915 on transience, where he's looking out at the barbarism of the First World War, all this incredible violence in his own day, and asking whether it really, what lessons are to be drawn. Should this really just be seen as humanity unmasked in all of its kind of savagery, and that these other values, these Enlightenment hopes and dreams, have really just been kind of an illusion, a self-delusion all along. And he replies to his own question, no, what we are to take from that history, and perhaps a history that feels again to be relevant around us today, is that none of these older traditions, none of these ideals can be taken for granted, and that they have to be chosen, that they're fragile, and that they have to be chosen by and defended and chosen again by societies at every turn. So speaking not just on behalf of memory, but on behalf of choosing these older traditions of humanism, was also something that I was delighted to invite readers to do with me in the book, and really happy to have the chance to talk about with all of you today. So thank you again for being part of this.
Thank you, Jeremy. And thank you all for joining us to listen and to engage with us as well today.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting, and thank you, Jeremy. And thank you, Ruth.